Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 9 critical design decisions for high ROI 360 feedback. I'm going to give everyone a minute to get signed in and Dale to get the slides pulled up. While we're waiting to get started, I'll take care of a few housekeeping items and introductions. I'm Jessie Beringer, Head of Marketing for 3D Group, and I'll be facilitating our session today. Please feel free to ask questions using the chat function throughout the presentation. We'll be answering as many of your questions as we can at the end in a Q&A session. So joining me to discuss high ROI 360 feedback is 3D Group President, Dr. Dale Rose. Dr. Rose is the founder of 3D Group and a nationally recognized expert on talent assessment, leadership development, and 360 feedback. Dr. Rose is a widely published author in academic journals and an author and co-editor of the recently released Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback. In addition to designing custom 360 feedback systems for clients, Dr. Rose personally coaches leaders in focus post-360 feedback sessions. While he most frequently works at the executive and C-suite level, he's supported leaders at every level from board chair to first-line supervisor. He's also a frequent contributor to publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, CEO World, and HR.com. So now I'll hand it over to you, Dale, to get us started.
Thank you, Jessie, and thank you all for joining me today to talk about one of my favorite subjects, 360 feedback. And in particular today, I think an important angle, if you will, on 360 feedback is thinking about ROI and 360s. I think certainly at the executive level, there's a lot of often question around ROI on HR practices. So I want to spend some time today getting into how to think about how to approach ROI when looking at 360 feedback. So some interesting stuff to go through here. Starting with the basics really are around what is 360 feedback and how does it look? How does it work? The gist, as many of you I'm sure are familiar, but still worth touching on, is that an individual, as we've got here, the feedback recipient, gets feedback from multiple individuals that they work with, typically clustered into groups based on their relationship to that feedback recipient. And as this image displays, one of the real keys is to recognize that you may get feedback, say, from your peers, direct reports, the other group, that may be a bit varied, right? So it's not like, while you will get sort of, let's say, an average score for your peers on particular behaviors, like admits mistakes, follows through on commitments, these things, you may find that those data are a little bit varied. So, for example, I like to point out this gentleman in the other group here on the lower right, who's got a pretty extreme opinion. I think one of the keys with 360s is to recognize that often in feedback processes, that one individual might be the sole person giving you feedback or determining, decisions around your employment, your progression, your training and development resources. But in this context, you've got many people providing feedback, and ideally it's used, of course, then to help improve and understand how that person's being impacted. So what's the value of this? What is the value of 360 feedback? Why do this, if you will? What's the benefit? Well, often you'll hear people, oh, feedback is a gift, right? It's and I think that's a well considered notion, that you should approach feedback as something being offered to you that is of value, a gift, right? But I like to reframe that notion a little bit and think about it more as an investment. So if you really recognize that people don't need, first of all, it's voluntary. Those individuals don't have to give you feedback. They don't have to tell you exactly what they're thinking. But if you create the environment in which they are more likely to give you honest, clear feedback that's relevant to your workplace, it's them really investing in your development as a leader. And so if you look at it in that way and saying, okay, these folks are investing in me, what am I now returning to them for their investment so that I can get them to continue to invest? That's really the approach you want to take, and you want to create an environment in which the leaders in your organization who are getting this process recognize it as such and treat it not just as a gift that they can keep, re-gift, toss away, whatever, but really an investment that's been made in them that they need to provide a return on by changing their behavior. So how do we improve the ROI of this process? Why do we think about ROI? One of the key things, if you just look at what an actual ROI analysis is, and I've done a few of these, they're pretty complex and involved, but the basic concept is, you take the benefits of any given thing and you subtract out the cost divided by the cost, and that gives you a percentage that will indicate the return on the investment that you're getting. If you've ever done one of these, you'll know that the cost side of this typically is much, much easier to get. What's tricky is the benefit piece. So inevitably, in every ROI that's been done, those benefits include estimates of what you believe has been the benefit, really. And in some cases, you've got real, tangible, concrete benefits. But for the most part, particularly in HR, you're going to be putting together some estimates of what the benefits are. So I'm going to take my time today in this presentation and divide it out into 3 different ways of thinking about and looking out at the benefits. So there are really kind of 3 basic ways. You can give someone more feedback, right? More is better, generally. You can make the feedback itself better, higher quality feedback. And then most importantly is really this beyond feedback piece. I think in HR particularly, we spend so much time on the work that we do to get those leaders' feedback. So there's, choosing the survey, creating the survey if it's going to be customized. There's identifying who's going to get feedback. There's introducing the idea to them. Lots of communications that go on. Then there's actually distributing out surveys to individuals to provide that feedback, and then sending reminders, and then you put so much work into it, and you finally get a feedback report, and you got to distribute that out to folks. But then the person gets the report, they have the feedback. In many ways, from an HR standpoint, it's like, okay, whew, boy, that was a lot of work, we're done. Well, not really. That's actually when the value, that's when the benefit starts, right? That's in a sense when for the most part, when the cost stops and the benefits begin. So don't overlook this beyond feedback piece. So I'm going to identify 9 different areas that fall into these various buckets. So the first bit is more feedback. So in this setting, this individual, if you think about the previous graphic that we had, less feedback is here, right? You've only got 2 individuals from that other group, 2 individuals from the direct report group, 2 individuals from peers. This is probably not going to be as valuable as the original graph where it was, 4, 4, and 5. The supervisor was still the same. But, what can you do to get feedback, to get more feedback than this? And I've actually even done a feedback process where a leader literally did not get anybody giving them feedback except themselves. Very interesting, difficult, challenging conversation we had there because everything's data, and people not giving you feedback is a pretty scary thing. So getting more feedback is super important for the value and the benefits. One of the things to think about is how much is enough. Generally, we recommend the self provides their own feedback. So the self does need to provide their own perspective, critical for understanding self-awareness. The manager, absolutely essential. Many organizations won't even provide a feedback report if the manager neglects to fill out the survey. Generally, peers, we recommend at least 7 get invited so that you get enough to be able to report anonymously, and also it's substantive enough. Again, it could be more than 7, but a minimum of 7. And then direct reports should be all. Whoever a leader is, works for, they should have an opportunity to provide feedback. And that could be, any number really. And then often there's an other group, which again would be 7 plus. The peer and the other group, we put 7 again because we really want to make sure you get a minimum of 3 raters. In our benchmark study, that's kind of little image of it down here in the corner, we do this benchmark study every 2 or 3 years where we evaluate what is the current practice, what are companies currently doing in the marketplace on various decisions in the feedback process. And 83% of companies in our latest study use a minimum of 3 raters to provide feedback in order to report it separately as a group. So, for example, if you invite 7 peers, you're likely to get at least 3 of them responding, which then allows you to report data separately about that peer group. So one of the keys with getting more feedback and trying to get it more to this kind of profile, right, where you've got that minimum of 3, is really sending reminders. You really got to send reminders. You've got to make sure you've got the right raters. It's tragic when people are invited to fill surveys out. We see it all the time where they're like, I don't even know who this person is, or I worked with them for a week or something like that. So making sure you've got the right folks that are actually gonna fill it out. And then make sure you invite enough. Again, we recommend for the peer group and this other group, you know, if you're going to need 3, you want to invite 7. So that's pretty important, and a lot of it also goes to purpose, making sure that people who are providing feedback recognize that this is a process that's going to be used to help improve folks, so they want to make that investment. So people often ask kind of what is a good response rate. Our average is 86%, was last year anyway, in terms of, you know, you across the population. So if you use the process right and you have the right environment, the right climate around feedback, you can get a pretty strong response rate. When it starts to get lower than that, you wonder, is this just a subset of folks that were willing to respond, but the ones that didn't, what would they have said? So you really do want to keep it in that 70+% range if you can across the entire survey. One of the key tools is targeted reminders, right? So we always say, you know, if someone's filled out a survey, stop bothering them. If they haven't, keep bugging them until they do. We all get plenty of emails, plenty of notices to take actions in the workplace, but there really is little that can be done other than that targeted reminder. You can send this out directly to the feedback recipient, the person who's getting feedback, and say, hey, too few people have filled out your survey for you to get a full data set. Can you remind people that you invited how much you value their feedback and how much you appreciate them providing feedback? So you can get you want to give them a template, make it easy. Don't say, hey, send an email to everybody. Well, okay, now I got to figure out what exactly I'm going to say. So provide them a template. They'll customize it a little bit. But the feedback recipient themselves reminding people that were invited that they value the feedback and value their point of view can be one of the most powerful ways to increase that response rate. The manager themselves, the person's manager or supervisor, that can be a lever. Again, you got to be mindful of climate and how that's gonna come across, but particularly on, say, rater selection. So let's say up front in the process, the feedback recipient hasn't gone in to identify who they want feedback from. Maybe you can contact them directly, but if they're not responding, levering their manager to say, hey, the person, your direct report hasn't even started this process yet. Usually that will get the attention needed. And then lastly, you can have HR or some administrator within the organization really follow up with individuals themselves and managers who are really critical, who haven't completed the survey and provided feedback, and say, hey, we really need the manager to fill this out. As I mentioned, some organizations won't even provide a report without manager. Some won't do it without self. So that you can also do direct outreach to the critical individuals who need to provide feedback. But these targeted reminders to the folks who have not yet provided feedback tend to be pretty effective. Okay, so that's one way we can get more feedback. Another question around more is, well, gee, should we be giving leaders feedback like, I don't know, should they get a 360 every week? Definitely not. Every month? No. Well, let's take a look at some of our benchmark data again to see what happens in the marketplace. What typically do people do? We often see these data, by the way, used by organizations to help internal communications around design. So when the question's being asked, how often do we do it? If you can come back and say, hey, this benchmark study shows that most companies do this at least every other year, if not every year, sometimes that can be helpful in persuading internal stakeholders. So indeed, that is what the data say, is that the most common is really every year or every 2 years. We have seen an uptick in kind of as needed, or kind of other diverse sort of things, or sort of like a one time we're doing this as an event. Those can be problematic, I will say, particularly the as needed, because when you see somebody getting feedback on an as needed basis, there's always a question of, well, why now? Why them? And those answers can be quite negative to the reputation of your 360 process. So if the rumor is that why 360 and why that person is because that person might get fired any minute and they're using it as a last second effort, well, that's not going to help you get real quality feedback, is it? So the nice thing about doing it on a cadence is you're scooping up everybody, and it's not like there's a targeting going on, and the rumor mill, if you will, gets a little bit calmed down. So we recommend a cadence that managers, leaders are expected to get feedback at least every 2 years. And again, it's just part of being a leader is you need feedback from people that you work with around how effective you're being. Another key question that has an impact on response rate has to do with survey length. People often ask us, well, how long are surveys typically? We've seen a bit of shifting in this. There was a spike we saw in toward much shorter surveys about 10 years ago, which can be problematic. One, is certainly one question is a little bit silly, but even 10 or 20 questions, really hard to capture the full spectrum of leadership. So you want to be very mindful of that. We do see kind of a range. Many years ago, frankly, a couple decades ago, there were surveys longer than 120 questions that can take 30, 40 minutes to fill out. So we really don't recommend that, and we don't see that as often as it used to be the case. They have shortened, but there are minimums you need to think about in terms of just getting enough breadth of coverage to add the value that you need to really make some decisions around development for those leaders. Average length is about 50 questions, a little over 50 questions. With 50 questions, and what we typically see is you can get in 50 questions can be completed in about 4 minutes if it's done well. Now the open-ended questions are a different story. If you have a couple open-ended, what could this person do better in your own words? We've seen occasionally, I have one client I can think of who literally each rater wrote a page and a half of single-spaced comments about those kinds of questions on 2 questions. What could they do well, or what did they do well and what could they do better? Those reports were, burdensome to read. So that took a lot longer, but the quantitative piece, 50 questions, 4 minutes, pretty straightforward. Discretionary effort. If they want to spend an hour writing a lengthy comment, well, that's up to them. That's certainly not required. But this is what we're seeing is, relatively shorter surveys than in times past, and again, I think if you keep it this way, it's a little easier to get people to respond because it's not so tedious. Probably the best thing is the shorter the items themselves. So like one of my favorite items is follows through on commitments. Very short, very clear. I can answer that question very quickly. So long, complicated items tend to slow people down because they get to the end, they have to reread. All right, so more feedback is going to be helpful. More is good, better is better. So better feedback, how do you get feedback to be high quality? And again, this is important from the standpoint of, let's put it in the context of that ROI, right? You're trying to get benefit. The core benefit for a 360 is that a leader is going to become more effective. They're going to understand the people they work with better, and they're going to be able to relate to them and communicate with them around how they're doing and how they're seen. So there's some team dynamics that can improve, some interpersonal relationships that can improve. But at the end of the day, if you're not giving them quality feedback, they're gonna ignore it, and then your benefits disappear completely. And so there's a couple of components to think about to get better feedback. The first one of these has to do with survey content and relevancy. So you need the survey questions to be relevant to not necessarily each individual job, right? It doesn't have to be, well, the marketing leader and the IT leader, sales leader, and they have slightly different technical knowledge. but it does need to be relevant to the workplace. So let me give you kind of the extreme other example. Worst survey item I ever saw. And this is a legitimate, well, I don't know if it's legitimate, but it is a commercially available assessment that asks this question. If Dale was a dog, what kind of dog would he be? And it literally lists 20 different breeds, and you pick them. And, if I'm at a workplace and I'm getting feedback on that item, think this is a joke. Like, I cannot think of how this is going to be relevant. Why would I invest in this? So on the other hand, if I get feedback on an item like, say, follows through and commitments, okay, that is relevant. I don't care if I'm in marketing, IT, it does not matter. Following through on what I say I'm going to do, that's pretty important. And if I look at my data and I say, oh, gee, none of my peers, none of them think that I excel at this. This might be something that ends up on my development list. So making sure those behaviors are clear and relevant and not distracting like this is super, super important. So thinking through survey content, probably the single best way to make that content relevant is to have it be very strategically aligned and at least the competency model that's being used to be developed at the top of the organization. Typically, it will be even the C-suite, maybe together on what's our strategy and what do our leaders need to do to achieve it. Let's brainstorm out a leadership model that links to that. Bang, that's relevant. And if you position it right and communicate well, now you have survey content that really is going to drive behavior and going to get the benefits that you want. I use an extreme example here, but I see many, less extreme, but also poor items, poor competencies, poorly communicated competencies. So be mindful of that survey content and make sure it's relevant and has some value within the organization, some real equity, if you will, in terms of people's mind share. So another way to get better feedback is to make sure that the people who provide the feedback are the right people. So choosing the feedback providers turns out to be quite relevant. I can give you an example where it was actually one of the first surveys that we did early years. This is our 30th year, so we've been doing this work for a long time. And the particular client we were working with, for whatever reason, insisted that no names of raters, people providing feedback, would be on the report. Now, of course, you're never linking, rater names to ratings, of course, but it needs to be confidential. But the list of who provided it is really important from a relevancy standpoint, right? If I'm looking at the data, just one example, if I'm looking at my data and I see that I've got, say, 6 direct report ratings, and maybe I have 9 direct reports. And I look at the data and I say, oh, well, the wrong 6 filled this out, right? My 3 superstars didn't fill this out at all. And that's why the ratings are low. Okay, or maybe I'm saying that as if I'm dismissing it. I may not be dismissing it. I may be embracing it and saying, oh, now I understand why these ratings are low, because those folks didn't provide me feedback. In the example I used before, where the no names of even invited raters, let alone the people who responded, were provided, it gave so many of those leaders in that cohort an opportunity to dismiss the feedback, because they'd look at it and say, okay, there's 6 direct reports. I don't know who they are. Were they even really my direct reports? Maybe it was the data got mixed up. Maybe it was Jane's direct reports. And it allowed people who were predisposed to want to deflect to be defensive. So being clear about getting the right feedback providers is super, super important. You want to think through who should select raters. So who should select raters? Largely the individuals themselves, because it creates a real investment in the feedback. I value the people that I've invited. The other one is maybe you want to have some approval. So you want to make sure that while they did invite, they didn't use necessarily the friends and family plan. So either HR or a manager can be going in, reviewing those raters, editing as needed. And then, think through the rater groups, typical rater groups. I'll show you some data in just a moment. It are really the folks that are closer to to the individual. Work with them on a regular basis, and that's who you should be selecting. So in our benchmark data, again, what we find is that for the most part, the participant the feedback subject selecting the data with their manager approving, that's kind of the mode. That's what's most commonly done. There are a number, third of companies that will just do it with participants only. But again, notice we've got 78% here that at least have the participant involved. Again, super helpful, that benefit. You're trying to get that benefit. You're trying to get leaders to change. If they don't believe in the feedback because the wrong people provided it, the wrong questions, et cetera, they're not gonna get you that benefit that you're trying to achieve. That we do see a small percent where HR is just the only individual, or others like the HR and the manager only doing it. But for the most part, you want that participant involved. It's gonna get you the ROI you're looking for. I think that the further distant, you're just giving them excuses. The other one to note is which rater groups are included. And by and large, it's the self is important, but peers, direct reports, direct manager, self, those are kind of the most common. We do see second manager showing up sometimes, and then customers are used occasionally. It's interesting, you can end up with sort of internal versus external customers, so that it depends on the target audience. But by and large, it's your peers, your direct reports, your manager, and yourself. That's pretty much your standard. And it's been that for a long time. I mean, we've been, like I said, doing this for over 30 years, so it's been pretty consistent. And we do have a white paper on this. If you're interested, happy to send it around, how to select raters and who should be selected, and some criteria for how to think about that. So I just like to highlight when we do write these things, it's nice to share them to folks who are interested and value it. So another thing from a better feedback standpoint is making sure that when those raters are providing feedback, they're doing it well, right? So, what you don't want is somebody going in and just doing all 5s or all 1s, or frankly, all 3s. You want them thinking about it and putting some thought and care into what that feedback looks like, so it's diverse enough to reflect what's really going on. For a long time, we've known that rater training is very effective. So you can train raters to provide very high quality feedback. Frankly, all of the research done is on this one that's at the very bottom, which is in-person training. I think very few folks are investing the time and frankly the cost in doing in-person training on how to provide high quality ratings in 360 feedback. It would probably need to be a very, very high stakes environment and circumstance and individual to justify that kind of cost. You're not going to get the ROI there. Interestingly, the closest version to that is probably a recorded video. It's a little bit more engaging than text-based tools. It can approximate kind of that in-person training. You don't quite get the Q&A part, which the calibration that comes from in-person training is very powerful. So we know there's plenty of research to show that when you do that training, you do that in-person work, you do the calibration, ratings will become more accurate and more valid and provide better quality. But again, the issue that comes up with rater training is always, okay, better, but at what cost? And the cost does tend to overwhelm in that environment. So this is where I think the recorded video that provides some context, but does it in a fairly short and interactive or engaging way is probably your best bet. It's not, it's the cost is so low. Text included in the survey, yes, very valuable. Do that. There's no reason not to. You can put some stuff in the email, assuming they read the email and don't just open it and click on the link, et cetera. So your benefits on those things are a little bit less clear, but a recorded video is a pretty easy thing to embed in those survey instructions. So that's really where I think you're going to get your best ROI. We have seen some great effect so we did some of the early work on looking at the value, again, think about it from an ROI standpoint, of open-ended comments. So this is really about rater training around how you differentiate numerically between people's behavior. But when you look at the open-ended comments, which people often value when they look at their feedback, how do you make sure those comments are good? We did a study where we looked at the quality of open-ended comments in 360 feedback and found that like 75% of them were kind of mediocre and would, mostly because they would identify a problem. They would say something like, Dale doesn't communicate very well. Okay, could you be more specific, right? So it didn't go into the length of saying, Dale doesn't communicate very well. His emails are far too lengthy and wordy, and I get lost in now I know what to kind of work on, right? So what we have found is that you actually can adjust that and tweak people's feedback to be high quality by giving them some instructions and helping them see that, something like this is it's not that useful, but you can shift just by putting instructions in there. You can shift the feedback to be much more useful by saying, hey, don't just identify a problem, identify like a solution, create, be clear and specific about it, and ideally give some suggested solution. So there are some rater training things you can do that are pretty low cost, because once you put those instructions in, there's no added cost. It's just being valued. And so the quality of that feedback is going up. Quality of feedback goes up, likelihood of change and accurate, valid change in ways that are making leaders more effective goes up. So I think improving those comments, huge ROI opportunity. All right, now our third section. So we've got more feedback. We've made the feedback better. What do we do once we've given the report, right? So, there's the ubiquitous, it's funny because we don't print these often anymore and we don't have desks often anymore, but we still call it the desk drop, which is sort of that like, here's your report, plop, good luck. Probably not the best approach. The notion being, okay, I've got my feedback, I've got my report, what do I do now? We've got to get beyond that's really when your benefits start. I mean, literally that moment is when your benefits start. So I think one of the biggest things you can do to improve ROI in a 360 is flip it upside on its head a little bit. Again, I mean, I've seen hundreds of RFPs and review processes for 360s. Almost always, all focused on cost upfront and the process of collecting and reporting feedback. If you flip that upside down and say, we're going to spend half our time thinking about what does the process look like and how do we get the process right, which is important to get good quality, more feedback and quality feedback. But we're also going to invest half our time in, okay, what do we do once we get the report and they get the feedback? Where do we want them to go with it? How do we help them use the feedback well? So I use again, this is, the extremes, perhaps make the point, at the end of the day, you really want people to use the feedback. We had a company that came to us, this was probably 15 years ago now, where they said, well, we've been doing 360s for a long time. We've got the process really down. It's super efficient. We can just, we can collect the data, we can get the reports. But the big thing we're worried about is that we did a review last year for the first time in 5-6 years of doing this, of how many people had, we started thinking about this, where do we go with the report? And so we started with, well, what percentage of people had actually downloaded the report versus like maybe somebody hasn't downloaded the report. We could start with that. 27% of their leaders had not downloaded the report. So over a quarter of the individuals that they put all the cost into to get them feedback literally never even looked at the report. I mean, that is pure cost, zero benefit. So I hope this is not you. If it is, you've got to start thinking about how do we make that feedback something that people want to use, right? So you can start looking at things like, well, what percentage of leaders are actually even looking at the report? You can probably get the statistic off your system pretty straightforward. Did they understand the feedback? Did they accept the feedback? I've got a great model on this where, we point out that accepting your feedback is the really critical first step toward actually doing something with it. If you're in that defensive mode because the survey questions were wrong, the wrong people provided, et cetera. You give them all these reasons. You're not going to accept the feedback, and perhaps appropriately so. When I did that one survey, I did not accept the feedback that any of these dog breeds were anything like me, for example. So, you got to make sure that you're putting some steps in there to get people to understand the reports, accept the feedback, et cetera. Did any of them create an action plan? What percentage of them did? Have they talked to their manager? So there's some things here that you can do to check in on what's going on after the process and evaluate where you need to intervene. What do you need to do to make sure that everybody does do an action plan? What do you need to do to support people in understanding their feedback? Note to self, make the report simple. We see so many complicated reports. It doesn't have to be that complicated. You shouldn't need a PhD to read your report. So make sure the report, if you find that your leaders don't understand their feedback, simplify the report. So lots of things you can do, but start with asking this question of, how am I doing today on some of these key things, without which I am getting zero benefit, right? Again, if you've got that 27% that didn't look at their reports, their ROI is quite limited. So what we found is that when we do our process the way we've kind of advocated, it works pretty well on these things. So you can also insert a survey like this. So after leaders get feedback and go through our process where they also work with a feedback coach to understand and get to that acceptance and make a plan, they really tend to understand what they need to work on. They've learned something about how to be more effective, and they've got a plan to get there. This was a study we did with a couple hundred leaders in 18 different companies across about a year period of time. And again, what we found is that these folks are getting ROI, right? These are the folks that are getting what you're looking for after you get that report. And that's the place really to put your focus. People often ask the question in terms of, well, what's the purpose? Is it, and for decades there's been this question of, is it for development or is it for decision making? Well, I mean, as a good friend of mine has articulated many times, it's his axe to grind. Anytime you're getting somebody assessment data that's telling them where they're being effective or less effective, and they're using the data to decide what they're going to do, it's a decision, right? You're making some kind of a decision. So even development is a decision about where am I going to focus my efforts. Our data tend to suggest that development is the core. Growth and learning and being more effective leader is the core of 360 feedback. However, some organizations will use it, as we see here, almost a quarter for both development and personnel decisions. So personnel decisions would typically be things like succession planning, that sort of thing. Development might be, the growth that you need to do to get there. In my personal opinion, an unfortunately large number of companies will let it just be completely self-directed. I think you probably end up with, the 27% number tells you the answer right there. If it's totally self-directed, a quarter of the people in that company, over a quarter, literally aren't even looking at the report. So some accountability, I think, is going to be critical to getting the ROI that you want, and to recognize that if you're a leader in an organization, you need to be involved in this process, because ignoring the people that you work with is not an option. So this is from Dave Bracken. He's the friend I was referring to, and he does this great job of kind of articulating what that development decision continuum is, to help us see that all of these are decisions, right, that can be informed with a 360 feedback process. And so don't wherever you are on the spectrum, be aware that there are decisions being made, and they do have an impact, and they can be more or less beneficial from a change standpoint and a value to the organization. I think one of the interesting things in this slide for me is the idea that there are lots of uses. So one of the key things you can do is to be clear about what is the use, how are we using the data. It's going to be for development, but also it can be for decision making. And how are we going to do that? Let's make sure that we're getting the most out of it. And one of the most often overlooked benefits that companies have, I think, is the idea that you can not just look at individual data, but you can also look at group-wide data. There's some real strategic benefit to looking at trends across groups to understand where do you need to develop people, what kind of growth opportunities do you need to provide across the institution. So again, our data reiterate this notion that development is sort of the primary tool. But if you look at succession planning, almost a quarter of companies there, half the companies are using it, as I was just describing, for curriculum planning. Career development, again, big decision. Where do you want to go with your career? Hypo identification is also on that list. For my money, I'd like to see those numbers on the bottom increase. I'd like to see organizations get better and better and better at how do I use this for, as an indirect, one of many tools, particularly for promotion, for hypo identification. I think these are applications that have great utility and certainly a fair amount of validity. So I think there are opportunities there, but at the end of the day, it's going to be development. Another key question that's going to impact the benefits that you're going to get as an organization and individuals as well is who owns this report, who's getting the report, right? So if the participant, I don't know, I don't honestly don't know what's going on with the 6% of people that aren't giving it even to they're like volunteering to be in the 27%, but some companies literally don't give it to the participant. They're probably only using it for those other sort of decision-making tools. Certainly, the more controversial or difficult question here is, does the participant's manager get a copy of the report? Again, you're going to get a little bit more accountability if the manager's involved, engaged, etc. So finding ways to involve that manager in the feedback process after the report is done is going to increase the benefits and going to increase your ROI. You have to look at your environment. We've talked at length in other settings around the idea that the climate for feedback in your organization, if it's being seen as a punitive thing that the manager is weaponizing against their team and their poor performers, that's going to be a problem. But if you can train those managers to use it constructively and use it well, maybe they don't get the full report with all the comments with their eccentricities. Maybe they just get a high-level summary to allow them to go in and work with their individuals and keep them accountable. Now you're getting benefit, right? Now you're getting the kind of benefit that you need to justify those costs. So engaging the manager becomes just a critical opportunity, and one that not nearly enough companies are taking advantage of. Another key thing around kind of that, after the report phase is follow-up. Super important that people getting feedback, again, go back to the individuals that gave them feedback and say, thank you for your investment in me, not that gift. Here's what I'm going to do to get better based on what I heard from all my raters, okay? Very positive, but also it's a feedback loop. You're telling them, this is what I heard and this is what I'm working on, and ideally inviting them to continue giving feedback as time goes on. A study by Marshall Goldsmith really highlights the impact that this can have. He did the study where he looked at coworkers who'd gotten feedback who followed up with their feedback providers and those that did not on this change scale. How much change did they create? What they found is that when coworkers didn't follow up, you can see the midpoint here is 0. There was still some positive change, but mostly, it was centered around the middle. Interestingly, when you look at the folks who did follow up, perceived change is quite positive. So negative change is on the left side of this, the -1, 2, or 3. Positive changes on the right. So following up consistently and saying, hey, this is what I'm going to work on, makes a huge difference difference is really going to jack up that, again, ROI, right? You're trying to get people to change. This is one of the levers you want them to pull. The last one I'm going to point out is feedback coaching. So feedback coaching, as our data have shown, is more, I mean, it's not necessarily ubiquitous, right? This is about 2/3. Last year we had a bit of a spike, last time we did the study. But feedback coaching is pretty common element of the process. And we find is that feedback coaching has a huge impact on accountability. Oh, I've got to meet with somebody. I'm probably going to download the report and look at it, right? So it pushes that agenda. And then it also significant support for action planning. So in that feedback session, it's okay, look, at the end of this, we're going to know what your top 3 things are, and you now can put together a plan on how to work on those things. It's just greasing the skids, if you will, and helping those leaders to do what they need to do to understand the feedback, to accept the feedback. Feedback coaches, that's usually job 1, and then to make a plan around what to do with it. So even just 1 hour of feedback coaching, this does not need to be a big, long executive, coaching engagement, but a real feedback coaching session, not focused on how do you read the report, right? You see these all the time, these debriefs where it's like, let's look at page 2, let's look at page 2. The person should have read the report. They should be starting from a place of I understand it because I've read it. Help me figure out what to do with it. Okay, and that's where you're going to get your biggest bang for your buck, is having that coach. I would say actually this might be well, again, you ask the wrong questions, you're dead in the water. But this one just has such a big impact in terms of real utilization for the kind of change you're trying to get, which is the core of that benefit. So if we try to put it kind of all together and look at it in whole, you've got costs that are there. They're easy to find. Focus on what are those benefits. What are we hoping to get out of this? Are we improving our climate around feedback? Are leaders making better decisions? Hypos do not like a feedback poor environment, right? They want feedback. They're trying to get better. They want to understand where they have gaps and where their strengths are. So if you're going to try to retain high potential leaders, make sure they're getting feedback and they're getting supported in it all the time. We see it does have an impact on turnover as well. So there are these benefits that you can find, but you just need to be clear about where they are and look for them and articulate them. Again, in terms of doing the hard calculation on an ROI, it's pretty tricky, right? How do you really quantify to be able to create that estimate? What a open culture and climate looks like. On the other hand, you can intuit, okay, it's really beneficial to maintain to retain our high potential leaders. If we can get leaders to be making better decisions, that's going to have value to the organization. So one of the things we've done in our benchmark study is just ask people, what business benefits do you see? And these are the 2 they identify consistently, is really retaining high potential leaders and those better decisions by leaders. So again, it's about self-awareness, right? That's how 360 is built, it's built on the idea of helping me see what other people see. And if I have blind spots, I may be making mistakes every single day. I can make a lot better decisions if those blind spots are uncovered. Now, the irony is, however, and this is sort of the, in a sense, the punchline here is that companies generally don't do ROI studies. Only 5% of the companies will actually, conduct an ROI study in a thorough, comprehensive way, right? And so, why don't they do that? Interestingly, no one's asked. So I wouldn't, you may be in an organization where they have asked. An actual ROI study is very difficult and expensive to do. If there's value in doing it, then do it. But don't feel as though you're the only one that's, everybody else is out there with a clear ROI percentage that's being presented to senior leadership and justifying their program. It's not really happening the way we might think. So, to recap, if you're going to increase your ROI, focus on these 3 different elements. Focus on the benefits. There are diminishing returns by decreasing costs. Of course, you don't want to spend wildly. That's not my point. My point is focus on what are those benefits. What are the benefits that our leadership values? And let's make sure that we're getting that benefit. My goodness, at least don't be the 27%. Like, make sure they're opening the report. We go back to those action plans. If you follow some of these steps, you're going to get better benefit, which is going to get you that better ROI. So I hope I provided some interesting insights, some intriguing ideas, and help provide some perspective on kind of the current state of play, if you will, in looking at ROI, which is easy to ask for and not necessarily easy to document. I know Jesse wants to talk a little bit about our current study, and then I want to open up to questions. So I'm going to turn the mic over to you for a sec, Jesse.
Great, thanks, Dale. So as you saw, Dale highlighted data from our last study throughout the presentation, a really fantastic resource that we created for practitioners to know what other folks are up to. The survey is open right now. We're collecting data through the rest of this month. So if you do have an active process, the requirements to participate are just that you have an active 360 feedback process and that you're somebody that knows the details and can answer the kinds of questions that Dale showed you in terms of the data. You get an advanced copy of the report. We'll invite you to sort of an exclusive release webinar. And, soon it will be available to you all as well. We'll be releasing it in the beginning of next year. Another quick thing to highlight is just, I believe Dale mentioned the Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback during one of those slides. This is a really wonderful resource that Dale contributed to, but also 30 other experts in the field. If you want to see how other organizations are using it strategically, this is a book to get. There's great case studies, again, sort of all the top experts contributing to talk about how you can level up. So with that, I have some questions here, and there's time if you want to enter some more in now. So the first question, Dale, is Veronica wanted to know, how can 360s be used strategically in talent management and talent development?
Yeah, so a great segue, and that's really the point of that book, is I think looking at, so the first step is to look beyond the individual leader. So, I mean, I could go like 500 pages on this, but I'll keep it simple. Most people think about 360 feedback as an impacting, improving, and developing an individual leader. Really, it also, when you do this with lots and lots of leaders, you can get some big, wide perspectives on the talent you've got in the organization. So I think the first is, census participation. Get large groups of leaders and look at those data. The other thing is, as I talked about before, look at your strategy, your business strategy, and line up the behaviors within the survey to achieve that strategy. Now you have relevance. Now you have ROI, right? You have real benefit to be able to understand, hey, we're trying to break out of a particular mold and move into being more innovative, more dynamic, faster paced. And we've told all of our leaders through the survey content exactly what that looks like for them. Those are two critical levers. But honestly, the book has at length many examples, case studies. I think there's 8 or 10 case studies of strategic uses, as well as a number of different discussions around talent management applications for coaching, integrating with personality assessments. So read the book, I guess is one way to say it.
So Brian asked, how can we use the feedback to, 1, drive improved performance, and 2, improve relationships among stakeholders?
Well, in the question already is part of an interesting point I'll make, which is it's not often that you have any implementation, any tool that you're going to ask both of those things of, right? If you could just get a tool that would improve people's performance, you'd take it. But to have one that also improves relationships between people, tall ask. Fortunately, I mean, that's kind of exactly what 360 does. When you do it well, and you, in particular, on that back end piece, where you're having people follow up, thank their raters. It starts conversations among individuals about how they can be better, which is what you're trying to create culturally anyway. So while the individual is in fact improving, the fact that you've invited people to give them feedback to be able to improve already starts opening up that culture, particularly if you have those follow-up supports. So I think this is a tool that really will do both of those, but it's the only tool I know of that could cover both of those bases, I guess is what I would say.
Jennifer asked, how can one get buy-in that these types of interventions make a difference? I assume she means senior leader buy-in.
Right. And the ROI, of course, is one of those key indicators like, hey, I can show ROI. So it makes sense and that Jennifer would have an interest in a topic like this. So I've played with this a bit. I remember a leader not long ago. I was talking to her. I said, let's survey all your leaders and see what value they're getting out of it. I think that's a pretty good way to do it, right? It's just ask the leaders, is this worth your time? Or is this valuable to you? Leaders, for the most part, I mean, one of the things leaders do is they decide how to allocate resources. If they see the value in it and they're going to report that to you in a survey, then you can share those results. I tried to do that with the CEO of an organization once, and he just looked at me like, why? You're just adding costs for no good reason. And I was like, well, okay, but don't we want to know that it's having a difference? He says, well, I get feedback. I work with you on my direct reports and their feedback. I know exactly the benefit of this thing. Why would I need to ask other people about that? So frankly, do the process well, design it well with support on the back end, and then let any doubters get the process. Just have them participate, and they will see inside of it why it is valuable and how effective it can be. That's probably the single best way, is to just give people, try it, you'll like it.
Leah asked, how do you transition from traditional performance reviews to 360s?
Yeah, great question. Really common challenge, folks. We've worked with many organizations where they start in kind of this development only mode. It's just for your improvement. And, there's a couple ways. It can take a little time to sort of incrementally increase the accountability side of it and get people comfortable that the ratings are anonymous. But really, it's about making sure that it's both development and performance, and doing those things kind of side by side. So in the book, there's a whole chapter on how to do 360 feedback for performance review. It's by Emily Campion and her father and brother. Brilliant, brilliant scientists, all three. And it's really great on, here are like 56 specific things you should do to make sure that your 360 for performance reviews are done well and validly. It actually came out of a court case where they were looking at a process to see if the use was correct. What's interesting is when Cindy McCauley, who's like one of the most famous 360 feedback and leadership development folks in history out of CCL, looked at this list and read the chapter, she said, wait a minute, that's exactly what a development process should look like. So in ways, it's kind of both the same. It's more just about getting the company kind of moved along that continuum. And acceptance, and getting them to accept that the process is valid and well done and has high integrity. But again, that book chapter, it's the best thing I know on the topic, for sure.
Yeah, I have one more. Is 360 the best method available for feedback, and what are the advantages over other types of feedback methods that have cropped up?
So I literally have my book chapter on that topic. I keep coming back to the book, but it's all there. Yeah, I think 360 feedback is the best feedback mechanism. There's all kinds of there was an effort at like this anytime feedback app kind of thing, and people don't want it. It's too much feedback. It's not valuable enough. It doesn't meet the criteria, the benefits I talked about. Usage drops off on those things really quickly. Ratingless reviews are really popular for a while. Turns out that open-ended feedback is not very great. It's kind of crappy, as our research showed, and creates some mess. Doesn't work very well. Again, my chapter kind of goes into this at length. I really think 360 feedback gets the balance just right in terms of being quick and easy enough, but also rich and deep enough. So I don't know of many other alternatives. Stakeholder interviews have been used, but again, you've got scale and cost. So from an ROI standpoint, a feedback survey is going to be far better. At certain executive levels, of course, stakeholder interviews are common and can be complemented with a 360 survey. But I would say, really 360 is pretty unique in terms of what the alternative methods for feedback are, particularly confidentiality. Yeah, I don't see a lot of other mechanisms out there that quite capture the value, frankly, that you get.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Somebody wrote in, will the PowerPoint be available for us at the end of the presentation? Email us. We'll be reaching out to you by email too. We can definitely share those slides with you. Thank you all for joining us. If you want to talk about how feedback can support your talent goals, reach out to us. Thank you again for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.